all of us have a suicide somewhere in our family tree. All of us have someone who was either institutionalized or would have been institutionalized on our family tree. Now, it might be far back. It might be our great-great-great uncle, but it's there. And I think that would help address some of the stigma as families learn, this is really common. This was in my family too.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionists podcast. This week, we are joined by Dr. Alexandra Lord. Dr. Lord has a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was a historian for the U.S. Public Health Service and is currently chair and curator of the Medicine and Science Division at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. She has written Condemnation, the U.S. government sex education campaign from World War I to the internet, and is currently working on Bridge, Suicide and its Afterlife in the American Family. So welcome to the show, Dr. Lord.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
I'm very excited to talk to you today because your background, your current work, your books are all very, very interesting to me. So at first, I wanted to start out with, I noticed that your bachelor's degree was actually in medieval and Renaissance studies. So I want to know maybe what sort of shifted your focus from that area into more recent history and specifically into the history of medicine.
I like to say that I'm always moving forward with my scholarship, and I started in the medieval and Renaissance period, and my last book dealt with the 20th century. And it's been a slow progression through my master's, my PhD. I'm just moving forward with each project. I was really lucky as an undergrad to study under a historian of medicine who did British history. And I began life as a British historian and became an American historian. So I've had a lot of transitions in my career, but I was really interested in the past and the ways in which people experienced illness, and in particular death, because death was so much more of a constant in the past, in the period before antibiotics. And so I really wondered, what would it be like to live in that kind of society where most people knew death in ways that we do not know death today? So even when I was working on something like Condemnation, which dealt with sexually transmitted diseases, that also could be lethal and really debilitating over your lifespan. So I was also really curious there again, what happens to people, what happens to a society when you have many people who are ill, physically ill, or many families which experience the death of multiple children or premature death of a spouse. And to me, in many ways, I think that's the biggest and hardest thing for us as historians to understand about the past. It's a very different place.
Yeah, I do. I always find it interesting how a lot of the times when it comes to, like, I study archaeological history very, very far back. And yeah, like death rates are a lot higher, especially, the further back you go. And people seem to generalize that, like, oh, because everyone died, like it wasn't as big of a deal as it is now, especially when it comes to children dying. They're like, they didn't care. They had spares. They had loads of them. Like, they died all the time. And I'm just kind of like, well, it's a human emotion thing. Like, it's not a rational, like, well, statistically speaking, we have high mortality rates. So, like, we don't care about that.
No, I think you can always find evidence of families that were just incredibly devastated. I mean, one of the stories that I've been following from my book is of a politician, and he lost 4 of his children and his wife to TB within a period of about 3 years. And I think it's what led him to become suicidal and depressed. And that was in an era when TB was very common, but you don't recover from that kind of thing.
Yeah. So a lot of your work, I would imagine, for your new project, which is on suicide and kind of the people in institutions who've committed suicide and their burials and sort of the laws and regulations around that as well. And obviously the grieving process for their families and the stigma that surrounds it. So how do you sort of do that research? Is it archival? Is it talking to family members?
So a lot of what I've been doing is archival research. And I myself actually do come from a family in which suicide was very prevalent. Unlike most American families, my family, for whatever reason, didn't move around much. So for several hundred years, they remained in the same area, which means that we have a lot of documents which tell the story of multiple suicides in our family. I'm also the child of a suicide, so I've been talking a lot to people who are my contemporaries as well to think about this topic. And I've become very interested in institutionalization of people who attempted suicide because that was very common in the late 19th and throughout most of the 20th century in America as well. So I'm looking at asylums, institutionalization. Suicide was a crime in most Western cultures, in fact, in many cultures in Africa as well. Many Africans who came to the Americas forcibly transported, but they themselves also came from cultures which condemned suicide. And in the Western culture, suicides were often supposed to be, they weren't always, but buried at a crossroads and buried with a stake in their heart. And that was supposed to be a part of a final punishment, but also to ensure that the body did not wander. And this was a practice. I think the last time that kind of burial occurred was maybe in the 18th century in Britain. But that's the background for the 19th century in America and why people were so condemnatory towards suicide and felt people should be institutionalized.
So I suppose when it was so stigmatized and when it was a crime as well, I imagine that families maybe couldn't mourn or grieve in the same way that we would today. So how did they sort of go about that process?
I'd say it's still stigmatized today. As the child of a suicide, I myself have experienced that suicide, my family. And when I speak to people today, they still indicate, oh, I keep this death hidden, the cause of it, because it's so stigmatized. People have such ideas about it. But in the past, it could be very difficult to grieve. And that's actually what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how communities responded to a suicide in their midst. And the law was very condemnatory. It was a crime in New York State, where I'm looking especially because New York was the largest and most populated states. And obviously our laws vary from state to state in the U.S. But in New York State, it was criminalized until 1913. So that puts a really heavy burden on a family. Not only have they lost a family member, but their family member has done something that is seen as a crime, something that is aggressively condemned in that society. But sometimes when I look deeply at some of these stories, it's really interesting because you see the community rally around the family to provide support. And even though there's an inquest, the sheriff is involved, it's seen as a crime, you still see the family grieving, and you still see the community providing care to the family that's experienced this. So there's a lot of disconnect between what the law says and how people respond to this. Sometimes, though, and I think this is true always with suicide, you always have rumors, speculation, and you can see that too in communities and what families experience as well. And that's true in the 19th century. What was it? One of my ancestors who committed suicide, there's, the newspaper says, many rumors were afloat as to the cause. And you think, okay, what was that about? And what were those rumors? And what did you all think? On the flip side, they also said, but much care is given to the family. So very disconnect there.
I imagine that there's a lot of situations like that where you end up maybe with more questions than answers when you're looking at like the official reports on things, and maybe you don't end up with as much information about like the actual individuals involved, like their feelings surrounding things as well.
When I started writing this, I was mostly interested in the families, partly because that was my experience as the child of someone who chose this. But I also realized I can't write a book about the people who made this decision because it's very rare that we know why someone made this decision. Despite, I know murder mysteries love the idea of the suicide note and it's hidden. And then suddenly in the last chapter, it's uncovered and you know the reason. Suicide notes are very uncommon, actually. So it's very difficult for us to know why people might have made this choice. Sometimes it's even really difficult for us to know if a death was a suicide, especially the further back in time we go. So there's a lot of speculation around Dorothy Bradford, who was on the Mayflower. She was the wife of William Bradford, who went on to lead the Plymouth colony. And William Bradford wrote extensively about his experiences. His wife, Dorothy, when the ship was off the lands of the Wampanoag, she slipped and fell into the water. There is speculation, and it's difficult to know if this is accurate. Did she choose to end her own life? And when you look at sort of the facts surrounding this, we'll never know. And I don't mean to say that there's an answer to this question, but it was November, December. The people on the ship were suffering from scurvy, which can actually cause depression. Puritans actually were known for being more suicidal than other religious groups because Puritans felt a need to really dig deep into the sort of basest elements of their character to be able to really repent. You really have to look at how awful you are. And so that was a process that really led many people to become very depressed. And Dorothy Bradford had left behind her family, including her child. So there's a lot of question around that. So sometimes we don't even know, was this a suicide or was this not a suicide? And we'll never know with her. But I find it fascinating to think, because Americans always start our history with Plymouth, which is an odd thing to do, given that there have been people in the Americas for thousands and thousands of years before that. But we tend to start our history with Plymouth. And if we start it with Plymouth, then maybe we're starting it with someone who chose to end their own life. And what does that say about how common this is and how much it's been a part of many cultures?
It's interesting to think as well. You mentioned there that it's more common amongst Puritans. Do you notice sort of trends maybe between certain groups as well?
So Puritans were definitely starting in as they're emerging in the 16th century, whether you want to call them Puritans, separatists, whatever you want to call them. They were known, and there was a lot of writing in the 16th century about how these people, these Puritans, these separatists, they are more prone to this. And there was a lot of discussion about this. If you look at sort of the literature in this late 16th, early 17th century. On the flip side, one of the things that I find really fascinating is every society, including our own, has always said suicide rates are rising. And the 16th and early 17th centuries, they said suicide rates are rising. In the 19th century, which is a lot of the period that I'm looking at right now with this book, suicide rates are rising. And there's always a tendency to point to a cause. So in the 16th, 17th century, which is a period of heightened religion, people point to religion and religious belief. In the 19th century, and I know it's hard for us to think about this today in the 21st century, where our world is rapidly changing, there's a lot of discussion in the 19th century. Well, suicide rates are rising because modern life is coming at us so fast. There's so many changes. It's really overwhelming. Of course, we would say, you don't know what overwhelming of modern life and change is. We do. But we also use the same kind of language around suicide. We also talk about suicide rates rising. It's difficult for us to know like what percentage of people really have ended their lives. When I spoke with experts who collect suicide statistics across the country today, they all told me, yeah, it's registered as the 11th or 12th leading cause of death in America, but we think it's actually it's higher. We think it's more common than most people realize. Also, in America, we have coroners who are elected and medical examiners who are not elected. And it's the crazy thing about America. We have a lot of different laws per different states and different communities. There's no consistency. But in places where coroners who are elected, there's a lower suicide rate. And the supposition is that that's because suicide's so stigmatized. Coroners who need to make sure voters are on their side, they don't want to tell families this was probably a suicide. So they'll record it as accidental death. Medical examiners who are appointed, don't have to worry about placating families, they tend actually to make a decision that this was a suicide more commonly. So that like indicates that these rates that we're talking about, they're not really reflective probably of the reality of suicide. So it's kind of confusing.
I suppose it's one of those things as well that you can't exactly ask people like, hi, why did you decide to commit suicide?
Exactly. Although it's interesting, like when you look at, so I've also been looking at asylum records and graveyards across the country where many of the patients in American asylums were buried in graveyards and unmarked graves. And sometimes in graves that we don't even know where the graves are anymore. They've lost track of them. But in asylums, they did try, when they had someone who had attempted suicide, they often did try to ask this question, why did you make this choice? And the answers are really varied. And I think that's probably true today as well. And suicide's very difficult to prevent. In the 19th century, they had this idea that we can watch people in the asylum. Often they were unsuccessful. People did end their own lives in an asylum, sometimes buried in an unmarked grave on the asylum grounds. So
I noticed from some of my background research that you were saying that a lot of the states, even today, will refuse to release records for historic asylums about the cemeteries, especially like regarding the burial of people who've committed suicide. Why is that?
So it's really an interesting question as to why states have refused to release this information. And it's only a tiny minority of states that have agreed to release this information. And we're talking about records from, the 1870s, 1860s, records that are well over 100 years old. And I encountered this because I began looking for the records of my great-grandmother who had been institutionalized in 3 different New York State asylums after 3 different suicide attempts. And the state said, we're not going to give you her records. And I was saying, we're talking about records that are well over 120 years old. Why can I not see these records? And there are a variety of reasons. One is that states have long argued that this is damaging to families' privacy. Of course, I was saying, but I'm the family. I want to have this material. But they've argued that these records should be kept private. And many activists across the U.S. have argued, actually, that increases the shame. You're saying that that having someone be in an institution, that this is so shameful, it should be hidden. So that's a part of why states today make this argument. But there also have been a bunch of laws that were passed that have made it really difficult to access any patient records. So in New York State in the 1920s, they issued a series of laws that really restricted who could see mental health records. And then in the 1990s in America, we passed an act under Bill Clinton that was called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And this act basically restricted access to any medical records. Didn't matter if they were records that were over 100 years old. Any records that are held by a public entity. So any records held by a government, for example. So most of the asylums in America were operated by state governments. So that means that all asylum records are absolutely inaccessible to people. And as part of that, they've also said that means that we can't even tell you who's buried here, because that would be a violation of HIPAA. So in 2013, historians and archivists, and probably archaeologists too, I don't want to forget you guys, but they all banded together and basically asked if at the federal level, HIPAA could be restructured to allow access to records that are over 50 years old, records that are historic in nature. Can those be opened up? So in 2013, a law was passed at the federal level. But here's the kicker about American laws and the way our government is structured. The federal government can pass a law like that, but then the states can double down and say, but you know what? We're still not going to allow you access. So most states then passed their own laws after this 2013 law and said, we're still not allowing you access to these records. A few states, Ohio is one of them, Maine is another one. After a lot of thought, they said, no, these are really important records. They're important for families who want to know, is my ancestor buried here? Or was my ancestor a patient here? My ancestor disappeared from the family record in 1940. We don't know what happened. I really want access to these records. So in Ohio and Maine, they've opened their records. In Oregon, they're slowly opening their records too. But other states, it's forbidden. So in many of these different states, we're still battling. We have to do it on a state-by-state basis, which is crazy, because we have 50 states that we have to take on. And I met with some people who were community historians, psychologists, curators, descendants of other people who'd been institutionalized as well. And we went to New York, partly because that was where I was most interested. That's where my family story is. But we also thought New York is the largest state. New York is the state that had the most asylums over the history. It was the largest state until the 1960s. So if we're going to change one state's law and try to set an example for other states, let's start with this one, because this has got the biggest cache of records. So we actually have got our law. New York has a dual legislature, so it's passed through one branch of the legislature. We're hoping to have it pass through the second. And that would allow family members, it would allow researchers, historians, archaeologists to look at these records, to know who was buried there, to know who was a patient, to understand why they were institutionalized according to the concepts of that time. I think it's what's the most, to me, really important part. I definitely want to see my ancestors' records. She did not die in an asylum. But I think for most people in New York State, it's really about knowing who was buried. Because when a person died in an asylum, the asylum superintendent would contact the family. Most of the asylums were done in the more western part of the state. So you're contacting a family in New York City, it might be a poor family. They don't have the money to travel to the asylum, to retrieve the body, to bring it back, to bury it in their community. So instead, the asylum would bury the body, and they would then put a marker, sometimes it was just a simple spike, where the grave was. And there are at least 55,000 bodies buried across New York State. And all of the relatives of the people who died in these asylums, they don't know where, which is the gravestone of my ancestor. When did my ancestor even die in the asylum? I don't know. Did they die in 1924? Or did they live, until 1960? So that's sort of what we're trying to change. And I think there's a growing push for this, partly because families are demanding it, historians want it, and archaeologists are discovering bodies across the country. They didn't even keep track sometimes of where the cemeteries were. So, for example, in Mississippi, there was an asylum. No one knew where the graveyard was. They went to a parking lot and began uncovering bodies. And there were 7,000 bodies associated with the Mississippi State Asylum buried there. No one knew. How do you commemorate this? How do you contact the families? And how do you enable historians and archaeologists to really understand what happened and to share the stories so we can understand why this happened? So it's a sort of long answer to your question, but it's been a slow process. So.
Yeah, I can't imagine having to go up against any legal system, let alone the American legal system, to try and get record information. That seems like a headache. Have to go through, but it is very important.
Yeah, we were very lucky because in New York State, so I had a personal tie to one of the legislators there, and so I contacted him. And when I told him about this, I was very, very lucky. And it's not like I knew him well or anything like that, but he just said to me, "That is the stupidest law I've ever seen, to ban families from," that was actually the word he used, to ban families from accessing information about their own health history, and just their own family story. So we've had tremendous support from many state legislators, but we've also encountered a lot of opposition from the Office of Mental Health in New York State. They're very worried they're going to be sued as families uncover information about their relatives. So on the one hand, we have people who are really supportive of this, and then people who are really opposed to this. There's very little middle ground. But I think more and more people are seeing how and why this is important. And the discovery of bodies, I think that really encourages people to ask a lot of questions. So I would say archaeologists are leading this in many ways.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say it's families also just finding out about their own history, or people in their family trees that just disappeared. Because one of my cousins is really into doing the genealogy of our family, and she's always, every family get together once a year. She's like, "I have a new story about a relative I've discovered." But I believe there were 2 brothers in our family that for the longest time she couldn't figure out what had happened to them, because they just went on a train one day and then were never heard from again. But it was apparently a euphemism of the time that taking a train journey was that they'd been institutionalized and they died in the institution. So there was, all the records were there. Once she found out that that's where they went, she could access all the records, but because no one in the family had discussed where they'd been sent, she couldn't know where to go to find all their records as well.
So in Ireland, are the records open then for you all to look at?
I think it's. I'm not entirely sure, but from what I gather, it's up to the institution itself, I believe, as to whether or not they'll release the records. I know that's the way for like marriage certificates or like christening records, because a lot of our genealogical work would be like going to the church, like the local church from where your family was, and pulling all the records from there. When it comes to the institutions, I'm not entirely sure, but she did seem to be able to get at least some of the records. So I think it's probably up to the place itself as to whether they give them to you and how much of them they're willing to let out to the public. But these were like, I don't know how many decades ago, but many decades. None of us alive ever knew these people. So long enough ago that it's not, violating anyone's, GDPR or whatever to be giving out information on them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also think, like, we who are historians and archaeologists, I think we sometimes forget the role of genealogists. I think they've played an extraordinary role, at least in New York State, too, in really underscoring what this means for people and uncovering some of the stories, too, and saying, I want the story. This is my family that you're denying this access to this story. So genealogists, they can be amazing in what they've uncovered as well. So
I was just wondering, how do you feel that if these records were to be accessible to researchers, to families especially, but to researchers, how do you think it would maybe change your understanding, or what do you think we'd be able to glean from these records that would kind of lead to better understandings today, maybe?
I think it would be really interesting, because I think more families would discover how common institutionalization was, also how complicated it could be, and that sometimes people were institutionalized for several years and then released back to their families. Sometimes you see evidence of families petitioning and asking for someone to be brought back. Sometimes you also might see information in which the family is saying, no, you really need to care for these people. We can't. So I think that would be really helpful in changing some of the discussion about this. Also, I think it would raise awareness just of how common mental illness and physical handicaps were. Most of us, I always say this, not most, all of us have a suicide somewhere in our family tree. All of us have someone who was either institutionalized or would have been institutionalized on our family tree. Now, it might be far back. It might be our great-great-great uncle, but it's there. And I think that would help address some of the stigma as families learn, this is really common. This was in my family too. And I think we tend to have fear of people with mental illness and sometimes physical disabilities as well. And so I think that would help address the stigma issue, which could be really important, along with sort of just this broader discussion about how common this is. So I think that would be provocative in many ways for more and more people to see a personal link to this. It's not just an abstract thing. I also think, we have a lot of discussions in America about how we should care, in particular for the mentally ill. And I think this could shift somewhat, because when Americans began building asylums in the mid to late 19th century, they invested a tremendous amount of money in this. There's a lot of really good care. I've been really lucky. I've been able to tour some of these asylums, and they're architecturally just beautiful places, built with an incredible amount of care and thought. But then they became quickly overcrowded, and the state just cut the budget. And I think it would be good for Americans to learn that story, that a part of our problem is our inconsistent funding. our, sort of refusal to really fund care and provide care for people. So that could help shape the conversation to realize that the asylum, we always think of the asylum as a place of horrors. And at the beginning, it really wasn't. It was a place of hope. So that could change a little bit of the conversation as we think about how do we care for people.
I think it's important as well the more we understand maybe why some of these places sort of started to decline, the better you can understand or predict how other institutions today are potentially on a declining path as well.
Yeah, I think in America in particular, we have very short attention spans, and we always think that we can solve a problem in 5 to 10 years, and when we don't, we turn around and just sort of walk away from the problem. And I think it would be good for us to realize this has been something that we've been willing to put in different amounts of effort at different times for this. And this is something that needs sustained effort over time, and it is very complicated. And I just think it would be good for Americans to think about that. We don't. So, yeah.
I noticed when I was reading up about your upcoming book that you mentioned that suicide rates are at a record high in recent years. Now, you've said that everyone says that at some point or another. So what do you think that maybe not what's leading to that, because obviously we can't really say, but do you think that by looking at the past for this, we can maybe kind of possibly see trends in large scale events maybe that are impacting this, or ways that we can maybe lower the rates again?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question. And I'm not sure I have a straightforward answer, but I definitely
I'm sure there isn't one.
But I was interviewing early on in the book, I was interviewing a psychiatrist who works in the field. And he said to me, our understanding of suicide is primitive. And I said, wow, that's really interesting. And he said, yeah, we really know very, very little. We understand very, very little about this. And I then have asked other psychiatrists and statisticians that I've been interviewing, I've said, this one person said, our understanding of suicide is really primitive. What do you think about that comment? And they've all said, oh, that's it, in a nutshell. So there is a part of me, and I know I'm a historian, so I always feel this way, but I feel that looking to the past can give us more information, more insight. I think it would be good. I was interviewing someone who works in suicide prevention, and she and I were having this conversation, and she said something about how she felt that the suicide rates are fluctuating, is the way she put it. And I said, well, that's interesting. In the past, they said suicide rates are rising. And she said, yeah, but I would say they're fluctuating all the time. And I said, okay, but my point is simply that every society seems to have believed that they were rising. And what does that say about how we think about this topic? Why do we think it's always rising? What is that? Where does that idea come from, especially given that our statistics and our knowledge of statistics around this topic are so fraught? And I think it's because, this is one of the most confusing deaths. Cancer, we can point to a cause, and sometimes we can even say, it's a factory down the road, car accidents. Well, we need to make our cars safer. But suicide seems to run counter to human, the biggest thing that keeps us alive, I think, is our desire to live. You're heading into a car crash and you're thinking, I want to live, I got to turn the wheel. But suicide runs counter to this. So how do we understand that? And I just think that the more data, for lack of a better term, that we have, the better we might be able to answer this question. I speak to people who are interested in, like, is there a gene that leads people to this? Is this a family thing? Is this environmental? And I don't think that there are no answers to that. There's no absolutes. And all the people I know tell me there are no absolutes with this. But I just think the more we know about how common this was, I feel, and I might be wrong about this, but when I read about suicide in the 19th century, it seems stunningly common. Stunningly so. It's funny, I was reading all the newspapers around my great-grandfather's suicide. And in that, like, sort of week, these were small regional newspapers, but there was a lot of discussion about suicide epidemics. That's what they call the cluster. And they were saying there are all these suicide epidemics in our community, blah, blah. And they list all these suicides that happened recently, right? This is a week after my great-grandfather entered his life. And that was reported in the newspapers. They don't even include him because they have so many people that they're listing. And this is in a very, very small, very rural region in New York State. So I think knowing and understanding that maybe compared to the past, maybe, we don't know, but maybe compared to the past, our suicide rates are lower. We don't know. And that could be provocative too, I think.
It comes to me as something that would be very difficult to put statistics on as well, because there could be situational reasons, emotional reasons, genetic reasons, mental health related reasons, and then also you're not sure if all deaths are suicide, so your baseline like number of individuals and like reasons why are all over the map. So it seems like a really difficult topic to try and to research and to understand as well.
I think it's also interesting to see those things that seem to be constants, at least ideas. So today, suicide rates among healthcare practitioners are higher than among other groups. And in the mid-19th century, medical journals started saying, you know what, our profession is more inclined to suicide. So that is really interesting to see that has been a truism. Well, if you want to prevent suicide, then maybe we need to talk about healthcare practitioners and really focus on healthcare practitioners. And maybe, so as we think about what can we learn, well, we can learn that this has been a constant in this profession. And I find it interesting. So in my own family, two of my ancestors who ended their own lives were physicians. They lived in a tiny, tiny town. They have 5 physicians. And 4 physicians. Of the 4 physicians, 3 of them killed themselves. What does that say? And how do we compare that and understand that today? Definitely COVID, people chose to a lot of physicians ended their own lives after COVID because it was so devastating. And I think this goes back to where we started the conversation, which is, what does it mean to live in a society where you encounter death frequently? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I've definitely heard of certain professions that, have higher rates, but I have always wondered, I'm like, is that just a stressor put on an underlying, condition or a genetic factor? And it's just that these are high stress professions and that's what causes it. But yeah, it's one of those things where you're like, if you put the same person in a different high stress environment, would it have the same effect? But obviously you can't study things like that.
Or even the question, so who is studying rates of suicide? Physicians. Would they focus on their own profession? I don't know. But I still think that the past can really help us really understand the present. It doesn't give us answers. It doesn't come with moral lessons for us, but it just gives us more data points, I guess, is the way to put it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it is interesting to know, and I presume it's impactful to know that these trends are not modern trends, like certain professions having high rates, or, amongst certain types of people, that it also probably informs what you were saying about, like, oh, rates are rising. Every society thinks rates are rising. Is it that they're rising, or is it just that we don't look at them in the past and therefore we presume that they're rising because within a certain number of very short years they have, but amongst the span of time, maybe it is fluctuating?
Right. Yeah. I think we always have two, and I'm sure you feel this way. I think all historians and archaeologists feel this way. There's a lot of nostalgia about the past, like the good old days. There were never any good old days. We all know that. So there's an idea that, people in the past lived in these jolly, happy families, and didn't engage in practices that are, like suicide, that are very difficult for us to understand. So I think that's a part of it too, to sort of like say, suicide's always been a part of the past. Crime has always been a part of the past. All these things that we see as modern, they've always been with us. And I just think we don't focus on that enough. I mean, I'm not saying that people think that the past was crime free or whatever, but there just seems to be a lot of nostalgia. I think definitely maybe less in Europe, because you all have a very complicated history that you're much more candid about than I think Americans. But I definitely think there's this huge strain of like this idea that in the past, families were intact, and, all sorts of myths about the past that are just not true.
So your book obviously focuses on kind of uncovering the lives of ordinary people who are in these institutions, and looking at families as well, and how these things can be generational, or, these are individual stories, and then they can also play into family stories as well. So I'm sure you've come across many sort of meaningful moments in your research as well, especially researching your own family. So what's maybe the most meaningful moment you've experienced while sort of reconstructing this topic?
It's how families tell stories, I think, and what stories they choose to tell and what stories they do not choose to tell. So in my father's family, like, we did not know this history. We didn't know this history even in the 10 years after my father ended his own life. We did not know this. So we never discussed this. And my father never discussed it. I'm not even sure my father knew, because it was, I said it was 5 generations, 4 men. The one person it skipped was my grandfather. So, like, we've always known that my grandfather grew up in an orphanage, but we never knew why. Well, he grew up in an orphanage because his father killed himself, multiple relatives killed themselves, and his mother was institutionalized after multiple suicide attempts. That part we did not know. So some of it is that, like, uncovering the roots of stories and discovering that there's a more complicated backstory. That's been interesting. But again, because I'm also fascinated by stories that we choose to tell. So my grandfather's older brother went to Cornell University out of this orphanage, which is also a really interesting story. In my family, he was viewed as like this brilliant, promising child. And while he was a student at Cornell, he died in what was the largest typhoid outbreak in the US. And in my family, that was the story that we always told. That was the tragedy of my father's family. Well, no, that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is that there were multiple people who killed themselves. The tragedy is that my grandfather's brother, when he became very ill at Cornell, he was brought home to the orphanage to die. He died in an orphanage, and he died in an orphanage because because suicide had really racked his family. So it's interesting that my family, they weren't denying a death and a tragic death, but they chose which tragic death to tell the story about. They chose not to tell the story of the suicides. So to me, that's been fascinating, how families massage and change stories, and choose to tell some stories but not other stories. Because, so as I said, my family lived in the same region for hundreds of years, very unusual in America. I don't know why. They just weren't as up and going, I guess, as everybody else. It was always heading west and moving and moving. My family just stayed put.
They were comfortable.
That's good. I like that. That's a better take than they were just too lazy to move. But when I look at the records that we have, the story was there. It's there in the records. Like, my grandfather knew this story. Like, how could he not have known this story? Because this was his experience. But he knew this. Like whether he told my father, I don't know. But my father, because the records were all in our attic, my father could have found this story. But I don't think he knew it. So again, really interesting what families choose to tell and what they choose not to tell.
I was going to ask if your grandfather knew, because I could imagine if he was very young when he was put in the orphanage, that the people running it maybe would have edited the family history themselves to give him a better story, maybe, or what they would perceive to be a better story.
Yeah, he was 3 when his father killed himself, and then 4 when his grandfather killed himself, and then 6 when his mother attempted suicide the first time and was institutionalized. He was the youngest of the children. And he, like, as is typical in the 19th century, you're shuffled from relative to relative to families, your cousins or your aunts, who they're not always crazy to take you in because they may be struggling to support their own family. Records indicate, and family stories indicate, that my grandfather and his brothers were very rebellious. Shock. You experience this in your family. Of course you're rebellious. So he was always sort of pushed from family to family. And then at 9, he entered an orphanage. So I'm pretty sure his older brothers, who definitely remembered their father's suicide because they were like 9 and 11, I'm pretty sure they would have told him. And then it's in the records that he was collecting, because he was a genealogist himself. He traveled all over, the region where the family was from. Yeah, it's really useful, although some of his records are wrong, but it's still very useful as a starting point. So yeah, fascinating. Why did he not tell his story? So only one of his brothers had children, and I contacted these descendants, my second cousins, and they also were like, what? We did not know this story at all. But actually 3 of them said, wow, this explains why our grandfather was just such a difficult man, really troubled. So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because your grandfather's clearly interested in the family records, but he himself is potentially keeping portions of it out and wasn't telling your father portions of it as well.
How old should they be? Here, how do we share the story? Which is really important to us. Siblings and the children of and who made this decision. And they told the children all I've nieces and nephews learned when about not 10. So for them, came time or didn't meet much time, which was cowardly. They were young. They didn't know. Obviously, my dad. In fact, their fathers know dad either. So yeah, so that's an interesting question to how you change, break the chain in which aren't family stories. How do you tell those stories?
So I was wondering if you maybe have any advice for people, specifically families who are trying to research their ancestors who may have died in institutions or were at some point institutionalized, and obviously that the records are difficult to get a hold of. Do you have any advice for people who trying to do that kind of research?
I think what's really important is actually contact the institutions to find out whether it's accessible, because it said it varies from state to state. Mentioned three states, Oregon, Ohio, and Maine, which allow access, but there are two or three states as well. Begin asking quite does my state allow access? For those who are in states, you get a quarter. I think it's really like getting a court order costs a lot of money. It's really important that contact legislators how that out. Because if you tell them, look, the state is not denying access to my own health history, own family history. We found legislators very open to recognizing how we're concerned about privacy, but we're talking about denying people own family histories, own health history. We've actually found them very receptive across the country. Once we started, we talked to legislators about this. Massachusetts has begun some progress as well, because the legislators are again, wow, we didn't realize that law done this, did not families access to their own history. Massachusetts patients do not access their own health records as well. It's really quite extraordinary. If you were institutionalized in Massachusetts, you can't access your own records, which is ludicrous. So I think the more people legislators begin to hear from people what this means, the more they begin to get changing the law. In New York State, we really were just like ask us up historians, archaeologists, psychologists, it's just archivists. Can you write a law for us? And we were like, what? We don't know how to write a law? It's 3 sentences, basically saying that the records will be deemed historic and should be available to public after 50 years, which there's a federal law. So it's not a difficult fix. And I think that's really the way to go, because you have to change the law. It seems impossible. We found when put it to the Senate, the Senate voted 50-1 for law. So it's clear legislators were, wow, yeah, that makes sense. Sure, there were legislators who thought I should research my own family history as well. So yeah, it's hard lift. I know it's that way, but I think the more people get together, the more it can be to change these laws. So some professional organizations like American Historical Association, the American Association for the History of Medicine, they are so in support of it. And getting that to sign off on letters, say this is really important, and to have the national mental health sending off a letter. Again, it wasn't difficult to get the letter, but that helped too. So I know that's insurmountable, but it's the only way to change this.
Yeah, it does seem like it would be quite the challenge. But like you said, like if everybody bands together, it's not on the individual. Like accomplish a lot more as a group, and obviously the people themselves who make the choices about these laws. That these are their families as well, and their histories. I'm sure they are interested to know where they came from and potentially what health factors, like run in their families as well.
Exactly.
Is there anything you sort of wish that the public could understand about suicide and its history or its impact across generations as well, that you feel like maybe doesn't get talked about enough, or that people don't really know as well as they should?
So I just had this like hidden kind of, sure my father did this. In my family, we didn't discuss it, hid it, as much as we could. I never told people. My dad died when people asked, I oh, heart attack. So a lot of shame around it. And I think about 10 years ago, I started to be more open about it. And I've been shocked to discover that many people whom I know, whom I worked with, neighbors, they never tell me my grandmother did this, or my aunt did this, my mother did this. And many of them have said to me, please tell anyone, please keep it secret. And there's a lot of shame around this kind of death. But I think people should know that their neighbor had that experience. A co-worker had this experience. So there's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The U.S. estimates that 50% of Americans will experience the death of a close relative or a close friend. It's a huge number. I think there we don't know this, so we feel very much alone when this happens and very ashamed. So if you look, and obviously I'm a method, if you look at the history of cancer, it's really similar. It was very stigmatized. People didn't talk about it. People did when they experienced it, when someone died of cancer. And in the 1970s and 1980s, activists began to say, wait a minute, why is this source of shame to families, individuals who are suffering from this? Let's be open about it. Let's discuss it. And so think of the point to make. This has always been with us side that many of us have experienced this. We need to talk about it. We should feel ashamed. We need to understand that it's always with us. We don't want to normalize suicide. We should normalize the experience of suicide, loss, suicide, grief. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with this, to show people it's how it's before. It's been part of American history. It's always been with us. It began with the flower, if you say that in American history. And I have a question about. And I think these are things that we really need to talk about and to understand the long history, because we can't begin to understand the end of death until we go and understand that it's been with us. It's been very common.
Yeah, I know in my own family we've had a suicide when I was a child, so I wasn't emotionally connected to it necessarily. I wasn't really emotionally connected to the individual in our family either, but it was one of those things, like, I knew it happened. I thought we were open about it, to the extent that you would be for someone we weren't that close to. They were just in the family. But it wasn't until I was much older and I found out the details of it that I was like, oh, we definitely did not discuss that. Like, I would have remembered us discussing like how it happened and the sort of story surrounding it. So it was one of those things that, like, we acknowledged that it happened, but we didn't acknowledge kind of the bigger impact of it, everything that went into it. And so there was that we were editing it, maybe making it less of a thing kind of thing, to just be like, yes, that happened. Let's move along and not focus on the details of it.
That's true. Yeah. And very common. When people do acknowledge, sometimes so. But understanding, I know we're here in our closet. I'm a historian. I know looked past, but understanding that certain things are not new is really an important thing. So, yeah.
Is there anything that we haven't discussed yet that you feel is important for people to know?
It's one thing which actually goes good sign. We talked about in Asylums, and I think there is a growing movement in the U.S. and conceivably in Ireland too. People are actually to the story of the girl had given birth and the boys there. I think Americans are into that story of how Ireland has acknowledged this. And I think in America now, beginning to talk about, we should acknowledge what happened at these asylums. We should acknowledge these burials. It's good because it's come from historians, archaeologists, coming from communities that want to go and share these stories. I think that's a real trend to open up our conversations of mental health, about suicide. I think that's a good thing that's happening.
Well, Leith, I've been so fascinated by this conversation. It's a really interesting part of history that I had never considered, thinking about before. But when you reached out, I was like, that is a part of history, like that can be studied, and it probably, really should be studied. It's a very interesting topic.
Well, thank you. I've been really pleased with this conversation. It's been really thought-provoking. I'm glad to see your podcast. Obviously, I think talking about death and the way in which we hear about death is long overdue. And as we often sort of discuss about worth it.
Yeah, I've noticed a trend of, talking to people this season where, the topics we've discussed are things that I never would have thought about, or that people tend to think are new. And then you have all these researchers that are like, no, they've existed throughout human time. Like, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We just seem to think that we did.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for being on, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in. I will see you all in next week's episode. Thank you very much, Dr. Lord.
Thank you.